How you doing, everybody? Welcome back yet again. I hope you are all doing extraordinarily well. So what we're going to talk about now is America at war, what life was like in the United States during World War II. Now, I really apologize, but because of everything that's going on right now, we are not going to have time to talk about the military aspects of World War II like we would normally do. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have posted another video that does detail the military side of the war, but this is mainly going to focus just on the United States. So as you should know, America at first, when the war broke out, when Adolf Hitler invades Poland, the war kicks off in 1939. America at first remains neutral and does not get involved. But America does get involved in World War II on December 7th, 1941, when the Empire of Japan bombed our naval port in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Following that, President FDR then asked for Congress to declare war. Congress agreed, and so on December 8th, 1941, the United States was at war. Now, the second that the United States declared war on Japan, Germany declares war on the United States. Now, this is important because Germany did not have to do this. Germany did not have to declare war on the United States, but they did anyway. So what we're going to look at now is how Americans responded to entering World War II. And there's going to be a lot of dramatic changes that are going to be required, and a lot of dramatic steps that Americans were going to have to take during the war so that they could survive. A lot of these changes are going to affect the economics. It's also going to affect their daily social life. And some of them are going to have a long-lasting effect even once the war comes to an end. So one of the first things that is going to happen in the United States, even before Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, is that Congress is going to pass something called the Selective Service Act. And this act is going to be passed in 1940. And what this is this is another example of massive government expansion and massive government expansion of power. This is the first time that during a time of peace that America actually entered into a peacetime draft. All other times, anytime there was a draft or any type of conscription for military service, it occurred when the United States was actually at war. What this act does is it required men ages 21 to 36 to register for the draft. Later, as the war progresses and the United States is actually fighting, that age is going to be expanded until the age of 45. Now, during World War II, the United States actually does implement this draft. Roughly 10 million men are going to be drafted, and another 6 million men are going to enlist. Also, many teenagers are also going to lie about their age so they can fight during the war. Just to give you an average idea of the average American soldier, their age, their height, their weight, who fought in World War II, the average age was 26, and the average height of the average American soldier was about 5'8". And the average American soldier weighed about 144 pounds. Now, only 1 in 10 of these American soldiers had attended college, and even only 1 of 4 had graduated high school and had a high school diploma. Now, once the United States actually enters the war, Congress is also going to move to create something called the War Production Board. And so this is created at the request of FDR. It's a federal agency that converts America's industrial output to war production. So what this does is this is literally the United States government created an agency that could go to private businesses and tell them, we need you to stop producing automobiles and we need you to make tanks, or we need you to make some type of material that could be used during the war. So instead of cars, a lot of automobile plants started to make tanks, jeeps, trucks, and warplanes. FDR, when he announced this creation's board, he said they wanted to make America a great arsenal of democracy. So basically, FDR's administration really worked to transform the economy into a very efficient military machine. What you see is really this ramp up of producing materials of war is actually going to help end the Depression even more, really, almost than the New Deal does. So, because of the War Production Board and because of the ramped up military spending, unemployment is going to drop from 14% in 1940 to 2% in 1943. By 1945, the year the Second World War is going to end, United States manufacturing plants were operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were producing something of 300,000 warplanes, 89,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, and 7 million rifles. Now, another thing that is going to happen is Congress is also going to pass something called the Revenue Act of 1942. And they passed this because war is very expensive. The Second World War is going to cost the United States something, if you convert it to today's dollar, something of $3 trillion. That's T as in trillion. And so what this is this was a revenue act that affected most tax workers. So by the end of the war, it made it where workers had to pay an income tax. There already was a graduated income tax that was created through a constitutional amendment. But what this does is this expanded who had to actually pay those taxes. So it increased the tax pool. It also increased the amount of dollars and the percentages that people were expected to pay in tax. So it generated something of 45% of the military cost. The Revenue Act was also encouraged to sell something called war bonds, which people could literally buy, and it basically was like individuals were giving the government a loan of their money, and the government would return it once the war is over with interest included. Now, another thing that's going to happen is you're going to see a massive expansion in something called the military-industrial complex. Now, what the military-industrial complex is it's a country's military establishment in industries that are producing arms or other military materials that are regarded as a powerful interest. So what this is basically the United States government enters into contracts with individual businesses and agrees to buy a certain amount of goods from that business. Now, what this does is this basically, a lot of people get frustrated with the military-industrial complex because the government was put in a position through this to where they could determine the industry's winners and the industry's losers. Now, what that means is basically if there were two companies that produced the same good or a similar good, the government would choose who they would enter in a contract with and who they wouldn't. Now, the military-industrial complex also includes other goods, not just actual what you would consider military goods. One of those goods, one of the companies who got a large contract with the government during World War II is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola signed a contract with the federal government to provide Coke to troops. During the war, Coca-Cola was providing something like 6 million bottles of Coke a month. And by the end of the war, soldiers drank over 10 billion, B as in billion, Cokes. So what this does is this really, even after the war ends, a lot of these soldiers are going to come home and they're also going to want to continue drinking their Coke. They're going to really enjoy it. Now, the other thing, the federal government signs contracts with cigarette companies and Hershey chocolate bars. So soldiers are also sent Hershey chocolate, they're sent cigarettes, and when vets return home, they continue by buying these same goods. Now, other companies, especially Pepsi, big Carolina company, is going to be very frustrated with this. They're going to argue that the United States chose with Coke, and that's not fair. Pepsi's going to write to the government. They're going to complain about these government contracts, and they claim that the government is literally picking winners and picking losers in the market. And to some extent, Pepsi was right, because you really see the companies that the government enters into contracts with, they really do very well. very well throughout the war. So that is something. Now, another thing you see is a really famous images and paintings that are published in the Saturday Evening Post by Norman Rockwell. And what these images are is something that FDR referred to as the Four Freedoms. So there's also big movements to support freedoms in the United States to help mobilize and encourage the public to get involved and be proud to be an American. These are some of the famous images. So right here, you're looking at the image that represented the freedom of speech. What this is a working class immigrant speaking at a town hall meeting. You also had images that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post that represent the freedom of worship. What this is it's people of all different religions praying and worshiping together in their own separate different ways. You have the idea of the freedom for want. What this image is it's a family at the dinner table at Thanksgiving. And it's saying, you want a protection of future prosperity and standard of living for all. For Americans coming out of the Depression, to encourage them that, things, you have things, be thankful for what you have. And the last of the four freedoms is the freedom from fear. And it is displayed by parents tucking in their children at night. As you see, the father is holding a newspaper, which is talking about the war. And it's a desire for a prolonged peace. Now, men are not the only people who are going to serve during World War II. In World War II, you're going to see some women who are going to serve. They're not going to serve necessarily in combat roles. That is a more recent development in American military of including women in combat roles. But this is going to be a watershed event for the status of women in the armed forces. And you're going to see women trying to get involved. Now, one way they're going to get involved is through something called the WACS, or the Women's Army Corps. So the WACS is a women's branch of the United States Army. By the end of World War II, nearly 150,000 women served in the WACS. There's also a Navy equivalent, there's an Air Force equivalent, and there's also a Coast Guard equivalent. Also, in addition to serving actually in uniform, women also worked as nurses. Other women also worked in the civilian workforce during the war, much like they do during World War I. So women are recruited to take jobs that were traditionally held by men. This is also when you see like the famous images of Rosie the Riveter, who excelled as a riveter in an airplane factory working. So you have, by 1944, 19 million women assume a job and take a job in the workforce, and they really mobilize and really work together and to keep the country going, just like they do during World War I. Now, Congress is going to also try to help military veterans, and they're going to help military veterans and people who are fighting during World War II by establishing something called the GI Bill. Another name for this is also called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. It's passed in 1944. And some people are excluded from this. So African Americans who served during World War II are excluded. Women who served in the WACS or in the other female versions of the military are excluded from this. But what it is it's trying to help the veterans get reacquainted to normal life once the war is over. So what the bill does is it provided for health care, it provided tuition money to allow soldiers to get an education, both at college and university. It also helped them find employment after the war, and it also allowed them to purchase homes through government low-interest loan programs. The bill is most known for education. It is still in effect today, and so it is common. Even in this class, I'm sure we probably have some people who are attending school on the GI Bill, and it at this time is now expanded to include women, although when it initially was passed, it was only for men. Now, You do have some colleges who complain about this GI Bill, especially the president of Harvard. The president of Harvard University complained that allowing veterans to attend college would be bad because he thought it would bring down the status of education and they'd have to lower educational standards. What it does do is it does cause overcrowding in higher education, but the veterans do very, very well, and they excel in the classroom. Now, as I said in the last video when we were talking about the New Deal, FDR had some very negative things happen during his administration, but far and above, the worst thing that FDR does while he is president of the United States is he issues Executive Order 9066, and he issues this in February of 1942. This is an executive order, meaning that it was done without the permission of Congress. Congress had nothing to do with it. It is all FDR. And what it does is it was an order to put all Japanese Americans into work camps. This was caused by the fear of the attack after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And so what it did is it forced roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans to leave their homes and to be transported into war relocation camps. These are also known as internment camps, where they were expected to work. The camps were covered with barbed wire. People were forced to live in stalls like animals. Many of the people who were actually put in these camps never had set foot in Japan. They were born American citizens. But what happens is during the war, because of this executive order, they lose all civil rights. They lose all rights they have as Americans. And this is a response that the government uses after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Supreme Court is later going to rule this unconstitutional in 1944. In 1988, an act is going to be passed by Congress to apologize for all Japanese Americans who were placed in these internment camps. And they also gave the people and their families who were imprisoned in these camps $20,000. But this is a very, very negative, very, very dark period in American history that shows the fear and some of the anti-immigrant sentiment that existed after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, there were other civil rights issues that also were taking place in the United States during the war, and that is with African Americans. African Americans bravely served during World War II, but they served in segregated troops. The very first war that American soldiers are going to fight in that are going to have integrated troops is going to be Korea. So during World War II, all American troops are still segregated by race. Now, this makes America look really backwards compared to the French armies and compared to the British armies who were fighting in unified, desegregated troops. So what this leads to is it leads a lot of African Americans to kick off something called the Double V campaign, meaning let's have victory abroad, victory in Europe, victory against the Nazis, and victory at home, meaning let's end segregation in the United States. So the African American men who were fighting for freedom during World War II, they refused to return home to segregation back at home. So this is a really big campaign that helps kind of kick off again and reignite a really broad civil rights movement that's going to take place in 1950. Now, one of the most famous African-American combat groups are the Tuskegee Airmen. They're a United States Army Air Corps that existed only of African-American pilots, and they were very successful. And their success throughout the war does help to encourage American military powers that be to desegregate the military. They flew more than 15,000 missions during the war, and they do outstanding well. They also were big supporters of the NAACP, and they helped to see the membership in the civil rights organization of the NAACP grow from 50,000 all the way to 500,000 people during the war. Now, another big thing dealing with civil rights during World War II involves a man named A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph is responsible for really launching the modern civil rights movement. And so what he does is during the war, he planned a whole march on Washington. And this march was to show the dissatisfaction of segregation in the United States. Now, the last thing FDR wanted to happen during the war is for there to be a large civil rights protest. And so what FDR does is he calls in, he works and tries to work with Randolph to try to calm matters down and try to show that he's going to try to assist in helping civil rights issues in the United States. And so Randolph agrees, and FDR also is going to issue another executive order to help smooth civil rights issues during World War II. Now, this march that Randolph planned is going to be carried out, but it's not going to be carried out until Martin Luther King Jr. is going to complete it. So the march in Washington that Martin Luther King Jr. helps lead was actually originally planned and organized several years earlier by A. Philip Randolph. Now, the executive order that FDR passes because of Randolph's fight is known as 8802. What it does is it banned discrimination in defense jobs, and it established Fair Employment Practices Committee, the FEPC, to investigate any type of civil rights grievances. Now, the problem with this is it doesn't really have any teeth. It had no money or no enforcement mechanism to actually protect civil rights issues, so it doesn't really accomplish all that much. And you do see massive race riots that break out throughout the United States, especially in northern areas. Places like Ohio, there's a huge race riot that takes place in 1943 in Detroit, Michigan. That leaves 34 people dead. So this does very little to actually end any of those issues. Now, another thing that the United States is going to do during World War II is they are going to start something called the BRACERO program. Now, what this is it started in 1942, and it is an agreement that Mexico provided seasonal farm workers on year-long contracts. And under this program, something like 200,000 Mexican farm workers entered eastern and western United States, and they mainly came in across the borders as undocumented workers. It led to a massive increase in Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and prompted a stream of anti-Mexican editorials and a lot of racist incidents that take place. You also see some riots that break out in Southern California because of this. But essentially what the BRACERO program does is it does help keep America up to pace with the food supply, and it helps keep the country going throughout the war.